The station's observation deck smelled like ozone and cold tea, and the old man sat with his back to the stars like they'd never impressed him much. I'd been told he wouldn't talk. 3 researchers before me had come back with nothing but a recorded silence and a polite request to leave. But I had time, and I had patience, and I had the one thing the others hadn't bothered to bring. I wasn't afraid of him. Welcome back to Nova Archive. If you're new here, this channel is where we dig up the stories the official records leave out. If that sounds like your kind of thing, drop a like and subscribe before we go any further. It genuinely helps more than you'd think. All right, let's get into it. "You're Telkai," he said without turning around. His voice had the gravel of a man who'd swallowed a lot of dust in his life, one way or another. "You people usually send someone taller to do the asking." "I was told you don't like being asked things," I said, "so I thought I'd just sit." That got a huff out of him, not quite a laugh. He turned finally and looked at me with eyes the color of a dying coal. Human eyes always looked like that to me, like something banked, waiting. He was old in the way humans get old, which is to say suddenly, all at once, as though youth were a debt they paid off in a single lump sum. "You want the cash line," he said. It wasn't a question. I want to understand what happened there. Not the fleet reports. Not the medal citations. I've read those. They don't say anything. "No," he agreed. They wouldn't. He was quiet long enough that I thought he'd decided against it after all. Then he folded his hands, the knuckles thick with old breaks that had healed wrong, and he began. "I was 26 the first time I killed something that used to prey. That's not how they write it up in the histories. In the histories, it's Corporal Aidan Voss distinguished himself in the defense of the Kesh colonial perimeter, personally accounting for enemy casualties in excess of, and so on, numbers standing in for the thing itself, the way numbers always do. I've read my own citation more times than I should admit. It doesn't sound like anything that happened to me. We weren't supposed to be there at all, not that early. Kesh was a Telkai world, no offense, new to the Concord, still finding its feet, 3 years off a treaty and about 11 centuries behind on the kind of war it was about to get dragged into. Your people had built beautiful things there. I remember that before I remember anything else. Terraced cities that followed the wind instead of fighting it, towers grown rather than built, some kind of layered fungal architecture that breathed with the tide. I stood on the perimeter wall the first night and thought whoever picked this world to die on picked wrong. It was too gentle a place for what was coming. We'd landed on what the briefing called a familiarization posting, which is military language for nothing is going to happen here, so go be polite to the locals. I believed it for what it's worth. We all did. I spent my first week on Kesh, learning which of the local fruiting bodies were edible and which would put you in the infirmary. For 3 days regretting your curiosity, and I remember writing my sister a letter that made fun of my own boredom. Told her I'd traded a war zone for a garden posting and didn't know whether to be grateful or insulted. I still have a copy of that letter. I've never been able to bring myself to reread the whole thing. I get 2 lines in and I have to stop because I know what I didn't know yet writing it. The Colonial Council held a welcoming ceremony for us on our 4th day in one of the grown towers near the river terraces, and Rethven Isis was there. I didn't know his name yet. He was just a young Telkai standing near the back with an expression I'd come to recognize later as the particular hunger of someone who wants very badly to ask a question he suspects will sound foolish. He asked it anyway, at the end when the council elders had finished their formalities, and the room had gone informal and loose the way rooms do after ceremonies. He asked whether it was true that humans had once fought a war against something called the Vorai and lost. I told him it wasn't true. We'd fought them and traded losses neither side could afford to keep trading, which isn't the same thing as losing, though I understood even as I said it that the distinction probably didn't mean much to someone who'd never had to make it. He nodded like he'd expected that answer and didn't quite believe it, and I remember thinking with the particular unearned confidence of a soldier on a quiet posting that I'd have plenty of time to prove it to him properly, later in some calmer way. I didn't know how little time either of us actually had left before the proving started. The Vorai didn't send an ultimatum. They don't, as a rule. Their doctrine holds that unclaimed biomass is simply biomass waiting to be claimed, and a colony that hasn't been formally recognized as protected under Vorai theological law isn't a civilization to them so much as a resource that has, through some oversight, been allowed to develop opinions about its own use. 3 hive cruisers dropped out of the dark 11 days after we made planetfall, and by the time the sensor techs finished arguing about what they were looking at, the first harvesting pods were already coming down. I want to be clear about something because I think it matters more than the fighting did. The Vorai were not cruel the way a person is cruel. Cruelty requires you to know the thing you're hurting has an inside. They didn't extend that courtesy to anyone who wasn't Vorai. When they took the outlying farms, they didn't torment the settlers. They processed them. There's a difference, and it's not a comforting one. A monster who hates you can at least be reasoned with, or feared into caution, or made to want something you can withhold. A monster who is simply harvesting doesn't negotiate with the wheat. I'd seen recordings of Vorai doctrine before Kesh. Every human soldier had. By then, it was standard orientation material. But there's a particular uselessness to knowing a thing from a briefing room versus knowing it from the smoke. In the briefing room, the Vorai were a set of tactical parameters. Hive cruiser drop patterns, pod burn radii, expected harvesting throughput per hour of uncontested ground operation. Numbers again, standing in for the thing itself. Standing on the perimeter wall and watching the first pods come down through Kesh's soft gray dawn, I understood for the first time that every one of those numbers had a smell and a sound, and a particular way of making the hair stand up on the back of your neck that no briefing room had ever managed to convey. Command had given us a fact sheet. Kesh gave us an education. I was part of the first response wave. 40 of us dropped in ahead of the main relief fleet, because Kesh didn't have 11 days to wait for the fleet to arrive properly, and neither did the 8,000 Telkai still inside the perimeter who hadn't gotten out. Command didn't send us because we were the best they had. They sent us because we were what was close. My squad held a stretch of wall along the eastern agricultural terraces. The layered kind, the kind that stepped down toward the river like a staircase built for something with better balance than me. I remember the smell most of all. Ozone from the Vorai pod burners, and under it, incongruously, the green smell of Telkai grain moss getting crushed under armored feet. I kept thinking, absurdly, that someone was going to be upset about the crop yield. That's the kind of thought your mind hands you when it isn't ready to hand you the real one yet. There was a Telkai boy. I don't know if boy is the right word for your people. Forgive me, but he read young to me. He wouldn't leave the wall. His name was Ruthven Eases, and he kept trying to help move ammunition crates with hands that were shaking too hard to be useful. And every time I told him to get to the shelters, he'd nod and then not go. I understand it better now than I did then. He wasn't being brave. He was trying to prove to himself that the thing happening to his home was a thing he could stand next to, rather than a thing that simply happened to him while he hid. I've met a lot of people since who needed that same proof. I was younger then, and I told him, more sharply than I meant to, that this wasn't a place for him. He looked at me like I'd slapped him. "Then what is this place for?" he asked. I didn't have an answer that night. I'm not sure I have one now. The Varai came at the wall in what our tacticians called swarm cadence. Not a formation so much as a pressure, wave after wave without the pauses a human commander would build in to let their own people breathe. Because the Varai command structure doesn't especially value the individual soldiers' continued participation in the war. They came and they came, and somewhere in the third hour I stopped counting, because counting implied there'd eventually be an end to what I was counting, and I no longer believed that. What I remember isn't the killing. People always want the killing. It's the part with the shape to it, the part you can put in a story. What I remember is smaller and stranger. I remember that Varai blood, when it hits hot armor plate, hisses like fat in a pan, and that the smell never fully leaves your gear, no matter how many times it's cycled through decon. I remember Private Amara Dushen, 19 years old, humming. Actually humming some tune from a colony ship she'd grown up on, the entire time she fed rounds into the belt gun, like her hands had found a rhythm her mind refused to be part of. I remember that fear, real fear, the kind that lives in your teeth, doesn't feel like the movies. It feels like being extremely, uncomfortably awake. Like someone's turned every light in the building on at once, and you can't find the switch. And I remember Ruthven Ease, who I had ordered to the shelters twice, standing at my shoulder on the wall with a scavenged sidearm he had no training with, because the shelter had taken a direct hit from a harvesting pod's landing burn, and there was by then nowhere else for him to be. You should not have stayed, I told him. It wasn't kind. I didn't have kindness to spare that hour. Neither should you, he said. This isn't your war. I didn't answer him then either. I've thought about what I should have said more times than I can count, standing on decks like this one years later, with nothing better to do than revise old conversations. I think what I would say now is that it became my war the moment I understood what harvesting meant, when it was pointed at something that could be afraid of it. But I didn't have the words for that at 26. I just kept firing. There was a stretch somewhere past the 4th hour when the belt gun on our section of wall ran dry. At the same moment 3 Varai breachers made it over the outer rampart, and for perhaps 4 seconds I've timed it out since. In my head, more times than is healthy, there was nothing between them and Ruthven Eases but me and a combat knife I'd never once used on anything that could think. I won't describe what those 4 seconds were like in the kind of detail that would make a better story. I'll just say that I have never before or since moved that fast, and that some part of me has never fully come back down from wherever that speed lives, and that I understood afterward, kneeling in the wreck of it with my hands shaking too hard to reload, why the old stories call it a red mist and not a red thought. There wasn't any thinking in it at all. There was only the boy behind me and the things in front of me, and some ancient arithmetic in the animal part of my brain that had already decided, faster than I could ever have decided consciously, which of those two facts it was prepared to live with. Ruthven didn't say anything afterward. He just put a hand, briefly, on my shoulder. The Tel-Kai gesture for it, I learned much later, is closer in meaning to "I saw what that cost you" than to simple thanks. And then he went back to trying to move ammunition crates with hands that still wouldn't stop shaking, because that was the only thing he knew how to do with what he was feeling, and I understood that, too, better than I wanted to. There's a moment in every fight like that one where the arithmetic tips, and you can feel it before you can prove it. A change in the pressure of the thing, like weather. Ours came near dawn, when the relief fleet's atmospheric interdiction finally cleared enough Vorai orbital support that their ground forces stopped being reinforced and started, for the first time all night, simply being spent. I watched a Vorai harvesting sergeant. I only learned the rank structure later from the intelligence debriefs. I watched it realize the ships weren't coming back for a second wave, and I watched the particular way its whole body seemed to recalculate, the antennae flattening back against its skull in what I'd later be told was the Vorai analog of dawning dread. It turned to run. Command doctrine said let it. A retreating Vorai carries information back to the hive mind that a dead one doesn't, and that information that Kesh was defended, that harvesting parties here would bleed, was worth more to us than one more corpse. I let it go. I want that on the record, whatever the record turns out to be worth. I let it go, and I've never regretted that the way I've regretted almost everything else from that night. By full light, the terraces were quiet in the particular way a place is quiet after it's been loud for a very long time. Not peaceful, just exhausted. Ruthven Iz's was alive. He'd taken a splinter wound to the shoulder that would scar badly and heal slow, and he'd fired his borrowed sidearm 11 times over the course of the night, and I have no idea to this day whether any of those 11 shots landed on anything at all. It didn't matter. He'd stood on the wall. That was the thing he'd needed, and I understood, finally, standing there in the mud, with the grain moss crushed flat around us, and the sun coming up the color of a healing bruise, that it hadn't been my place to take that from him, whatever my orders had been. "You're bleeding," he said to me, which I hadn't noticed. "So are you?" I said back, which he hadn't either. We sat down together on the wall, the two of us, and didn't say anything else for a long time. Somewhere behind us, Duchenne had stopped humming and started crying quietly, the way people do when the thing they've been holding together finally realizes it doesn't have to anymore. Nobody moved to comfort her. We just let her have it. That was its own kind of respect, I think, though I couldn't have explained it that morning. The relief fleet's forward elements reached the perimeter 4 hours later. By then, we'd counted our dead. 6 of 40, which I was told afterward was a remarkable ratio, and which felt, standing among the 6, like the least remarkable thing in the universe. The Tel-Kai Colonial Council sent a delegation to the wall before the day was out, and I remember the head of it, an old woman with the kind of stillness your people carry that I've never once managed to imitate, looking at the line of us, filthy, bloodied, half of us still shaking with the adrenaline coming down, and saying something that the translator rendered, a little clumsily, as we did not know what we had asked for when we asked for humans. I've turned that sentence over more times than any other thing that was said to me that year. I don't think she meant it as a compliment, exactly, and I don't think she meant it as an accusation either. I think she meant something more like what I've come to believe myself, which is this: my species is very good at a particular, narrow, terrible thing, and the goodness and the terribleness aren't separable from one another. We didn't stand on that wall because we were braver than the Telkai defenders, or the yet more terrified colonial militia, who'd broken and fled in the first hour, and I won't pretend otherwise for the sake of a better story. We stood there because something in us, I still don't fully understand what, and I've had 40 years to think about it, doesn't know how to stop feeding a fight once it's started, even past the point where stopping would be the wiser, more survivable choice. It's not virtue. I want to be honest about that, sitting here with you now, because I've let too many people walk away from this conversation thinking it was virtue. It's closer to a flaw that happens to be useful in exactly the narrow circumstance of somebody else's home being harvested for parts. The Vurai, for their part, filed Kesh away as a resource node with unexpectedly high extraction costs, and moved their harvesting doctrine elsewhere for the better part of a decade. I don't know if that counts as a victory. I've stopped being sure the word means anything out past a certain point in a war. The old man stopped there, and for a while neither of us said anything. The stars behind him hadn't moved, of course, but it felt like they should have. Rethven Izzes, I said finally. Did you? He runs a growers' collective on the resettled terraces now, Idan Voss said, and something in his face loosened, just slightly, at the question. Sends me grain moss seed pods every harvest. I've never once managed to grow the damned things in station soil. I keep them anyway. Why? He was quiet again, longer this time, and I thought that might be the end of the interview after all, that he'd given me the story and nothing further belonged to me. But he surprised me. You asked me what happened at Kesh, he said. The honest answer is that I still don't fully know. I know what we did. I've never been sure it was the same thing as knowing what it meant. Every year the seed pods come, and every year they die in soil that isn't theirs, and every year I plant them again anyway, because I think that not planting them would be its own kind of forgetting, and I've done enough forgetting for one lifetime. He looked past me, out at the dark. Your people called us the mad butchers of the stars once. Did you know that? Before the treaties, before anyone bothered asking us why. I've never entirely disagreed with the description. I just think it leaves out the part where we were butchering for someone most of the time, and not simply because we liked the work. Does that distinction matter? I asked. To the ones on the wrong end of it? No, he said, without hesitation, and there was something almost like relief in how quickly he said it. It doesn't matter to them at all. It only matters to us. That's rather the point, I think. The distinction we tell ourselves about our own monstrousness is a story we tell for our own sake, not theirs. The Telkai don't need to believe we're righteous. They only ever needed us to be standing on the wall when the wall needed standing on. Everything else is just how we've learned to live with having been useful in that particular way. He stood then, slowly, the way old humans do, like gravity had become an opinion he was choosing, out of politeness, not to argue with. Tell your researchers, he said, that the metal citations are accurate, as far as they go. They're just not going to tell you anything true. If you want true, you have to sit with someone long enough that they stop performing the story for you and start just telling it. Most people don't have that kind of time to spare on an old soldier's grain moss. I have time, I said. He almost smiled at that. Yes, he said. I noticed. He left me there on the observation deck, and I sat a long while after, looking out at the stars the way he had been looking at them when I'd first found him. Not with wonder, exactly, and not with fear, but with the particular attention of someone counting something they had once, a long time ago, stopped being able to stop counting. I never did learn whether Ruthven Ease's seed pods ever took root in the end. I imagine Voss doesn't know either. I imagine he keeps planting them regardless, and I have come to think that this, not the wall, not the 11 shots fired by a frightened young man who'd refused to hide, not even the 6 dead counted among the 40 who lived, is the truest part of the whole account, not the fight. What people do afterward, when the fight no longer requires anything of them, and they choose to keep doing it anyway. Thank you so much for listening all the way through. If this one hit for you, let me know down in the comments. And if you're not subscribed yet, consider it. There's a lot more where this came from. Take care of each other out there, and I'll see you in the next one.